You're listening to the O&P Check-In, an SPS podcast.
This podcast brings you the latest happenings in the O&P industry. We're unpacking trends and news from this tight-knit orthotics and prosthetics community.
Thank you for joining us. My name is Jackie Green. I'm a marketing specialist at SPS.
And I'm Brendan Erickson, regional sales manager here at SPS.
Welcome back to our listeners. If you're new to the O&P Check-In, here is what you can expect. In each episode, we provide a quick SPS update and discuss hot topics in O&P with leading professionals in the industry. In case you haven't heard, SPS has updated our rewards program. The 2 and 5% discount structure has been replaced, and clinicians will now receive a 3, 5, or 7% discount on rewards items purchased online. The team reviewed every category and every product to carefully select high-volume, quality products in key categories to help our customers find the best products. There are now over 40,000 items on the program, with 85% of them being typically stocked, which can make a big impact on your clinic every day. Learn more about the program and see the full catalog of rewards products on our website under the Rewards tab, or follow the link in our show notes. All right, so I am thrilled to welcome certified prosthetist orthotist Jess Norrell to the podcast. So Jess is the owner of Mosen Solutions, which specializes in strategic business solutions for healthcare practices. We are excited to chat with her today about a method of documentation called SOAP, and that is SOAP, which is an acronym for Subjective, Objective, Assessment, and Plan. So welcome, Jess.
Well, hi guys, thanks for having me. Probably the most interesting topic I think I've been asked to talk about because, nobody loves soap notes, right? But it's a really important topic, so I'm glad you guys are giving this space for soap notes to be discussed because it really does. We need to talk about them, so happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I am excited to go through this topic. So to kick us off, for listeners who have not met you yet, could you give us a little bit of your background and how you became involved in O&P?
Yes, of course. So my journey, I think, is much like, I don't know, it's very family oriented. So when I don't want to give away my age, but when I was 15 years old, my uncle needed help in his business, which was an O&P business, it is an O&P business, and I needed a job. I was playing varsity basketball at the time, and so balancing a basketball schedule with an actual job was pretty much not going to happen. I couldn't be consistent, and I needed a job that was really inconsistent. And so my uncle came up with a brilliant idea of having me come help at his office. So he would come in on the weekends and do business ownership work, whatever that was, or his clinical notes, or modify something. And I would go in there and clean the lab or stock the stock room or file soap notes. And it's funny because one of my core memories from starting out in O&P was this manila sized folder he gave me, which was no bigger than a 4x6, right? And it had probably hundreds of dictations in there. And he's like, hey, can you take these and go to those charts over there and find where it is in chronological order and go tape it to the spot? And so my first introduction to soap notes, which they weren't really soap, they probably were an S and a P maybe, was taping them to the back of charts. And so I would read them, of course, and be like, oh, this patient came in 1980 to have a check socket. Oh, and they're coming back in 2 weeks. That was the extent of the note at the time. And these were not my uncle's notes. I really definitely want to say, hey, Uncle Rick, you're great at soap notes. These were not his notes. These were the previous owner's notes. It was just get them into the chart at the time. And so, yeah, I started just cleaning the office, and then I became obsessed with what my uncle was doing. He was so great at patient care that once I got to college, I started in O&P and did my residency with him. And then after my residency, actually during my residency, I started my master's program in business because I wanted to help on the business side of his practice. And it went well for a bit, but we both kind of decided to move on from that. And I went to work for an EMR company. And then about 3 years ago, I started my own business of consulting with practices. My time at the EMR company was great, but I really, like, as I grew there, I was managing teams instead of working with the customers. And I really love working with the customers. So I decided to create a business that I could work hand in hand with our profession.
I'm going to call you an expert on soap then, because it sounds like you've been doing this and you've really dug into it and you love it, and you're passionate about it. But maybe there's some listeners out there that don't quite know what it is. Do you, or can you please just elaborate on what soap is, where it came from, how did it evolve, become the best practice, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so I don't know that we can really distinctly define when it became best practice in O&P. And it really didn't become best practice in the whole medical profession until about 50 years ago. So somebody named Dr. Lawrence Weed developed what we now know as soap. And he really developed it for like the physician patient care side for complex patients who had like multiple diagnoses as a way to just templatize how they documented that information. And so, as we know, O&P is several years behind in how things kind of navigate through the healthcare spectrum. So if that was 50 years ago, just in, basic medical practice, I would assume that maybe soap didn't hit really O&P till about 30 years ago, which isn't a long time when we think about it. And so as we're thinking about the evolution in O&P, some of our old clinicians might like this. We have to give a little bit of grace for how it's been in our profession because it's really not a old standard of what we're used to doing. Now, for the students who are coming out, it's the old standard for them. They need to know soap, and there's no way around it, right? Um, but to the second part of your question, you asked like, what is soap? And so Jackie did a great job of introducing it in the beginning. It's, subjective, objective assessment and plan. It's a way to organize your note. And it's like the original template to creating your note. And so the questions that you ask go into each of those sections as you're documenting your patient care.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
I mean, it looks like a big, it should be a detailed professional letter that anybody, whether it's the physician, the insurance company, or even your patient can look at and go, oh, yeah, that really reflected my appointment. In the 80s, when we're writing, patient was seen for check socket and they'll be back in 2 weeks, that doesn't reflect the appointment with them. If we're fitting a patient for a check socket and we have to do modifications, we have to do dynamic alignment, we might be fitting several feet at the same time, talking prosthetic patients. We have to document that interaction in a way that everybody can see that story. And again, kind of going back to my history in O&P, I remember as a resident, like my uncle was my residency director. And so anytime I wrote a note, he was critiquing it. So I went through a very stringent like SOAP Note 101 course just from Rick Stapleton alone. But it's why, I do what I do now, because he really grounded into my psyche the importance of telling a story. So I think kind of going into something we're going to talk about later is kind of the misconception of a SOAP note is it's not a to-do list item, right? It is really that story of what is going on with that patient. And so when we talk about subjective, just subjective alone is what the patient is reporting to us. Like, hey, I'm coming in today because I'm in a lot of pain, or I twisted my ankle 3 weeks ago, or I fell 5 times in the last 10 days. Whatever that patient is verbalizing to you, you're documenting in that subjective part of the note. And then the objective are things that you're measuring to justify what you're doing for that patient. So it could be outcomes tests, it could be any performance measures or goals that you're documenting. That objective part is just it's really just the objective part of the note. And then the assessment is where you tell the story, like you take it's like a math equation. You take the S plus the O and it equals the A. So you're taking the subjective and the objective and you're formulating whatever has been said and whatever you've measured to be true and creating the assessment for why you're doing what you're doing. And then the plan is what the next steps are. So patient's going to come back in a couple weeks after we chase down paperwork, get authorization, get those physician notes, and we see them for that next step. So it is kind of like a math equation, but just a lot of detail in that equation itself. There might be like some squares or subroots,
Well, you make it sound so simple, and I think the acronym is great, and it seems like something you could apply to everything in your life, not just medical records. But it's such a good, standard format, and you start simple, but it could elaborate into so much more. And I think it's just a great base practice, right?
Right. And I think that's where clinicians get hung up is when it becomes much more than a template, right? Because every patient is different. Every device type, everything you're doing with every patient is just so complex most of the time because our field is not simple, right? And so I think we get stuck in that, the minutia of it, and we just like, I just want to write simple because that's going to be easiest and I don't have to, try and regurgitate everything.
So, in your consulting work, then, what are some misconceptions for O&P professionals and that they might have about documentation? Because this clearly you can get, like you're saying, you can get sucked into this.
Yes. I think the biggest misconception, if I had to start with one, and this can be blamed a little bit on our pair problems that we have, is that the biggest misconception is that we feel like our notes don't matter, right? Our notes don't matter because all the payers care about is the physician notes. And the reason our payers care about the physician notes is because our notes were so bad. Before we started following the SOAP note format and before we started adding the detail. And so we haven't earned the respect of our payers with our notes. And now that, I think it was about 5-ish years ago, CMS said, we just want the physician notes. We don't care what's in your notes anymore. That caused a lot of people to go backwards and say, well, if my notes don't matter, why put in the time? And I want to equate that to outcome measures, right? Payers are not asking for outcome measures as a justification for what we're doing or why we're doing it. But that doesn't mean we don't do them. We do them because it's the long game. We want to prove that the products, the services, everything that we provide adds value to that patient life and beyond. And same with our notes. Just because our notes aren't seen in the eyes of our payers doesn't mean they don't matter. They add to that whole story of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think another thing I want to tie into this is last week, I don't know if you guys sat in on the AOPA/Academy advocacy webinar, but they were talking about how we're deemed as suppliers versus providers. And I think our notes tie heavily into that. When we just write in there, we gave this patient a device, we'll see in 2 weeks. That's a supplier mindset, right? Amazon is a supplier. We place an order, Amazon supplies it. If our notes just look like we got an order and we supplied it, we're no greater than a supplier, right? If we take the time to show that we're providers through our notes, so we saw the patient today, we heard what they had to say, we heard what they had to say, and then we documented that, we did some measures, we formed this story for what we're providing and why, it starts to separate us from that supplier versus provider spectrum that we fall in with the payer population. And then the last misconception, really, that I'm sure every clinician won't give up is that it's just a checklist thing to do, right? It's just a checklist thing to do. Like, I'm seeing a patient, I'm doing my eval. If I order my parts, I do my L codes and I do my SOAP note. I've done what I need to do for that appointment and I dust my hands and I move on. But that note is not just a checklist item. Like I said earlier, it's for your patients, it's for your payers, it's for your staff, it's for the business. It is for everything beyond just a checklist item.
Awesome. And I'm going to give a little shout out to Sam Burlett. I travel with him a lot, and he always tells people when he's presenting, he says, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. And it's just so simple sometimes when you think about that, like, oh, hey, look, I've got to document everything I did so that I have a plan for myself. That's the first thing. But then, like you said, if other people are relying on you to be the provider of this information so they can follow up or they can review it and assess whether they're going to pay for it or not, It all starts with you, and you just got to do it, right? So, I think it's super important, and I love the fact that you're helping people out. What are some of the specific pitfalls that you see out there that, common mistakes people make that they can kind of avoid? And I don't want to take away from your consulting business if you're
Oh, God.
giving this away for free on a podcast, but
No, absolutely. I mean, I think honestly, soap notes should be free information, right? Like if this is the baseline for how our profession is to be respected, we should be doing everything we can to elevate that, right? And I do want to say, also giving a shout out to Leslie Sissons. I don't know if she's done it recently, but she gives a killer um, lecture on getting and keeping your money. And the bottom line is your notes, right? The physician notes have to corroborate, but your notes are the gateway not only to getting the money, like that's the first step. And honestly, that's the easy step. The hardest step is keeping your money. And if you can get it, great. But if you can't keep it because because you didn't take the time to do proper notes, like it's the easiest thing to do. Um,
so do you
so
find some people just don't even do them, and like the first step is just doing them, or?
I mean, yeah, sure. First step is just doing them, and honestly doing them in a timely manner, because we get so busy, but if we schedule our clinicians like every 30 to 45 minutes, 5 days a week, sure, they're never going to get notes done, right? They have to have time to document great notes. And that might be one of the answers to the question, like just giving clinicians time is half the battle. So some of the pitfalls that clinicians face: one, time. They just don't have the time. The second one would be resources. And I think that's why, like, when you guys first approached me about doing this, I was like, oh, soap notes. But then one of the questions I got asked are like, well, what are the resources out there? And I struggled to find resources out there for clinicians who wanted to get help with soap notes. And about a month or so ago, I was doing a clinical training with a new clinician resident for practice, and I was introducing her to like how to put her note in the EMR system. And I said, so how to follow the SOAP outline. And she kind of looked at me like I had two heads. I was like, you do know SOAP, right? She had not heard the acronym SOAP. And so I think as a profession, while something as basic as SOAP is like, or some of us think SOAP is basic, we probably need to do a better job of creating resources for our profession. And then just honestly, education. I think we expect SOAP to be so basic and just, I just document what happens in the room. But I think we need help with that. So, yeah.
So are there mediums out there within the EMRs? I mean, you talked about how your uncle, I guess, dictated onto a piece of paper and then you were taping them. Are there different mediums around there that you find are more successful than others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that goes to the type of clinician that you have. Because, like, you know how there's different types of learners? There's like somebody who does well with virtual and somebody who needs more hands on. I would assume that there's different types of clinicians kind of when it comes to documentation. So some do great doing the dictation, and that's still out there. I think A+ dictation services is one that's commonly used. And then there are some that use templates. And your listeners, we probably have 50% who love templates and the other 50 who think templates is a slippery slope. And I used to be on that side of thinking that they were a slippery slope, but I've come around because I can see how templates can help just get everything out of your mind so that you can just follow not even a checklist, but it's just kind of one of those prompts, if you will.
Yeah.
And so, the slippery slope with templates, that's always kind of been the murmurs beneath the ground, if you will, are that you don't want your note at the end of the day to still look like a template, right? You want it to be very specific to that patient. So if you're going to use templates in your practice, it can start as a template, but by the time you're done with it, it better look not like that template. It better,
Unique, yeah.
yes, very unique.
I remember back in the day during the rack audits, there were software systems out there that would, read your notes and they would deem it as a template or not, like you were just copying and pasting, and that's not good enough.
Yeah.
It needs to be unique, and it needs to be, I guess the best word here is that subjective part of it, right?
Correct. You asked earlier about how the EMR systems can help shape that process. So currently, I'm like familiar with one specific to O&P, and then probably a few outside of O&P. So I'll talk about the one I'm most familiar with. And there are ways to either create your templates within the system, or there's forms that can help you and kind of coach you through. So there are things. I think the roadblock with those is the time it takes for businesses to one, create the templates, or to use these forms that doesn't make the appointment last an hour and a half. And there's some balance to having a really detailed note and having your patient sit there for an hour and a half while you're trying to fill out this note with them there. So I think clinicians have run sometimes from these templates because it becomes overwhelming and they want that patient to feel heard, but they don't want them sitting there for an hour and a half while they're, jotting all this down. What I can say though is the more you use the template or you use the system effectively, the less time it takes. You just have to put that time in up front.
How much is too long?
Oh man. So that gets into probably like, a trend that we see coming, which is scribes, right? If it's taking you too long because maybe you're not the best typist, or your chicken scratch, you can't read it, 5 minutes later once you leave the room. Scribes are a great model that I see kind of coming out in the space when it helps to shaping documentation and the advancement of our profession, really. But yeah, it's hard. And I think too, one last comment about the templates. When I think about being in clinical care, you're bouncing around. Like, you don't have a day just designated to transtibial, prosthetics, and then another day designated to foot orthotics, and another day designated to scoliosis patients. They're all woven in throughout the day. And so your mind has to bounce around from, okay, I'm seeing this prosthetic patient, to this follow-up AFO, to this scoliosis delivery. For your mind to bounce through all of those and what needs to be said and what needs to be documented is overwhelming. And so using a template can help guide you through those things without having to constantly like make your brain work.
Do you find it more successful if people do it immediately after the visit, or do some people wait till the end of the day and try and do it that way? And
That's a spot on question. They are 100% more successful if they do it, even if they start in the room with the patient and finish up right before they see the next patient. End of the day's next best case scenario, but generally, if they're not getting it done in the room, they're hoping they get it done by Friday before they leave. Like, it's not happening at the end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a template lover, so I'm someone who would very much so, at least in the beginning, starting the process of using SOAP, I would highly benefit from something like that. But obviously, like you're saying, you move away from it as you get more familiar with what information you're looking for and need to be tracking, kind of thing.
Right. I mean, 10 years ago, we weren't tracking height and weight consistently. And now our admin are getting that before the patient gets in the room. So it's something we just have to evolve on and realize, like, we just have to grow. We got to stop fighting it.
So you had kind of talked a little bit about trends that you're seeing kind of shaping documentation, and you had mentioned scribes. So I'd love to know more about that.
is that when you actually have like a scribe from the medieval times following you around and like writing down everything you do?
Yes. Yes. And if you don't document it correctly, like, drop your head. So a few of the practices I consult with right now have adopted this scribe model, and one of them has probably been doing it for, I don't know, 5+ years. And so they have two clinicians. They're smaller practice, but they rock it. Their notes are done by the end of the day. Notes, ordering parts. So the idea is that, and their model is one scribe per practitioner. Now, you could have one scribe per multiple practitioners depending on your size, but this scribe follows them in on their appointments, and we've set up a template. So that scribe knows exactly where everything is going in the template. And the practitioners also know that template like the back of their hands, because that's just been their model for the past, 25 years. So as they're doing the evaluation, the scribe has their laptop there and they're documenting right into the EMR, getting everything in. by the end of the day, like I said, the note when they leave that room is 75% complete, maybe spelling, massaging it on the back end. But codes, work orders, all of that is in there. So really the next step is on the admin team, and there's very little time in that delay. So I think what clinicians are starting to recognize is like that initial eval note is the gatekeeper along with your L codes for the rest of that admin process. Because if your authorization depends on the physician notes and your clinical note, if they have one or not the other, they can't submit for auth. So that scribe model helps to not only like turn that eval time around quicker, but really that whole patient prescription time gets shortened because the scribe is basically taking some of that easy work, if you will, off of the clinicians, so that they can ultimately see more patients.
Are you seeing people use family members as a scribe, or I mean, are you hiring somebody that's professionally, I am a scribe? How does that work? Because it just seems like
That
such an interesting thing, and I think maybe some people will think it may be too high of a cost to do it, but it's obviously worth it.
Yeah. So there's been a mix. I've seen kids coming out of high school who kind of really don't know what they want to do. And so they know they want to do something in the medical profession and they can type. And so they'll start there. I have seen MAs or even future doctors who are just doing scribing for a year so that they can get through medical school, or that entry level school just to learn about O&P profession. So it's not I would say it's not a resident salary when we're talking about the scribe. It might be close to that within 10K, but it just depends on the skill level that you get and where that person is in their professional career. But anybody who has great typing skills can listen and that they're willing to learn. They don't need medical background to do this job well. They just need to be willing to learn and can type quick.
So, are there any other trends that you have kind of noticed shaping documentation?
So yeah, I've seen clinicians starting to block time on their schedules. Like, just, hey, I need an hour at the end of the day to do my job well, whether that's ordering parts, getting my codes in, finishing my notes. They're starting to block some time either in the morning or the afternoon just to knock out that paperwork time. And I commend them for that because there's that balance of, hitting numbers, whatever that may be, but I think the our profession is starting to realize numbers can only come if you have all your documentation in. So you can hit your numbers, but if you don't have good notes, again, it goes back to that concept of getting and keeping your money. You can't keep your money if you don't do the other 75% of the
Well,
work.
I think your mental health as well, right? I
Um,
mean, like when we had Jerry Stark on, he was talking about burnout, and I would assume that somebody that dedicates time to do their follow up and their notes sleeps much better because they're not thinking, oh, shoot, I forgot to do this, or what am I doing tomorrow? I mean, you just have this active, continuous plan.
Right. And yeah, I mean, burnout is such a great topic. Jerry talked about that at the AOPA Leadership Conference, and he's such a great speaker. But yes, I think it's doing that time blocking definitely helps. And I'm sure Jerry could correlate all this because he's the statistician of us, right? Um, but I wonder what it'd look like if we understood kind of the balance of the clinical load schedule with the paper schedule. And, some of our clinicians are still modifying their own casts. So there's a lot to balance with that patient care aspect. And burnout is high, and he'll tell you it's highest, I think, I'm going to quote him wrong, but it's like in that 11 to 15 year range, I think, is the highest. um so
Well, and he
watch those
was even
clinicians.
seeing trends in that of even some of the younger students coming out. And I think that probably has to do with the burden of debt, that a lot of the students come out with. But, I love the fact that he even says schedule a time for you to have some lunch. You know,
Hmm.
it's pretty darn amazing what
Yes.
we put ourselves through. And if you can just schedule things, and soap sounds like you got to do it, like you said, Leslie said, you just even keep the money that you had. So we can't skip out on this. We can't just put it towards the end of the day or the end of the week because it's so important.
Right. And I think going to just scheduling your lunch, looking at your schedule strategically If your Monday is full of initial evals, like my heart hurts thinking about somebody's note time. If you have 6 initial evals and that's your most important note next to your delivery, you're stressing yourself out for the rest of the week trying to get all your initial eval notes done. And especially if you don't have time to actually get them done. So I think along with time blocking and ensuring you have time to do your notes, that's not just on your lunch break, because you should have a peaceful lunch break, not thinking about your notes, but looking at your schedule and making sure it's diverse and not stacked with initial evals or stacked with adjustments, and making sure you have some space in there to breathe between those appointments. Two additional things, and one's kind of honestly something I've thought of most recently that I would love to see our profession add on, maybe, but this is probably a stretch. I think if we started adding our clinical time to our SOAP notes, I think that would be really impactful again for the visual elevation of our profession. So when the insurance company gets our notes and they see, hey, patient was seen for a test socket today, made some adjustments, we'll see them in 2 weeks for another check socket. Well, what if you put on there that that patient was there for an hour and a half because you were doing alignment, you were making sure the foot was, properly underneath them, you were heat modifying the socket or adding pads to the socket, showing them the time and then also the detail of what you were doing, I think tells the story in a broader sense, or it paints that, wipes that brush for them. And I just kind of wonder what that would do for the insurance company if they saw, like, at the end of the day, man, that check socket that we're paying $200 for, that was an hour and a half appointment, you know? And then at delivery, how much time did you spend with the patient at delivery? So I don't know that that's a trend, but I would like it to be. I think it would be good for us to start showing how much time we're spending with our patients.
It's a great tip.
And then,
Well, and I
yeah.
probably even goes into the discussion of off the shelf versus custom, and how people are billing for some of those items and distinguishing it. If you put in your time, obviously, wow, this was a custom device and I worked, 46 minutes on it.
Right. And even when you do those off the shelf AFOs, like that patient's in the office for 30 minutes. They're doing paperwork, they're taking some admin time, but you're also, taking their shoe, you're trimming the foot plate, you're making sure the strap fits around their calf well. If there needs to be extra padding, you're making sure like they're not just walking out on something that, again, they could have ordered from Amazon. So yeah, I think it would be great for our profession to do that. Our company is working with, again, our clients on data mining those appointment times. So we're starting to try and do some big research around that so that when it comes time to kind of prove to CMS or insurance companies, like, hey, when we bill for 5301, that's actually 14 hours worth of appointment times, not just that device you see at the end. So we're working on something pretty cool and hope to publish that within the next year. But
Well, that data set is so important too. Like we had Shane Werderman on, and all of the outcome measures that Hanger is doing with this vast pool of data that they've collected over the past 10 years. I mean, how helpful is that just to have the data sitting there so you can look through it and find trends?
yeah, and this actually is funny you brought up Shane. This last trend is an
Ode to Shane. All right.
It's the additional documentation of goals and outcomes in the SOAP note. So SOAP is, subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. A while back, we've tried to add the O and the G in there, which is outcomes and goals. Again, those are so incredibly important when we talk about the longevity of our profession. And what Hanger is doing right now is hopefully going to be really impactful when it comes to payer relations. But as an independent supplier out there, like, just because Hanger is doing it, we can't expect Hanger to continuously lead the way with everything. We have to have our independence just as bought into some of these things, and documenting goals and outcomes is a huge part of that. But independents have just as much of responsibility in this as the big ones do.
So what training resources or tools are available for somebody who wants to learn more about documentation?
So I don't think there's enough out there, as we kind of have like surmised that through here. And I think there's not a lot out there because, again, this is a dry topic if we're being really honest. But when I first started at the EMR company I worked for, we were very deep into creating the forms within the system, right? And so the owner asked me to get a book, and by far it's the gold standard that I recommend to anybody. It's called Physical Therapy Documentation. I have the second edition. I'm not sure if there are more editions. Definitely can be found on Amazon. I recommend every clinic to at least have one of these in their practice. And I know it says physical therapy on it. That's probably our closest like sister profession, right? As far as documentation and kind of how we bill and get paid and all that good stuff. But it is so detailed. It gives examples of proper SOAP notes, like where things go in to each section of the SOAP note. I mean, it's not, you guys can see it. It's not a small book by any stretch. And it's solid. So if I had to give one reading resource, it would be that. And then, maybe we can have some awesome partnerships with Academy or AOPA to create some basic resources for our profession, because I think it's needed. Even templates, even if there was just a standardized template set out there with the caveat of adjust, you make it unique for everybody. I think that'd go a long way.
Well, I think I can speak for Jackie. We had an awesome time speaking with you. And we'll put all of the links in our show notes to both that book that you're mentioning and your contact info. But is there anything else you would like to add? You've got open ears out there across the nation.
We pretty much hit the hot stuff. I guess my only thing is, if you're really just starting off with, hey, I am that person that's just documenting the basics, just build one section at a time. So for your subjective, if you want to get better at SOAP notes, start with your subjective and figuring out how to build that out. And then once you've spent 3 months honing that in, start with the next section. You don't have to do it all overnight. And I think, we all run away from those big, hairy, audacious goals because there's so much to choose from, but just break it down slowly and give yourself a year to really become a specialist at writing a SOAP note.
No, it makes a lot of sense.
Eat that elephant one bite at a time.
Exactly.
It is.
It's an elephant.
Well, Jess, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
So if you would like to learn more about Jessica or Mozen, that is MOZN Solutions, visit moznSolutions.com or follow the link in our show notes.
Well, there you have it. Thank you for listening to the O&P Check-In, an SPS podcast.
If you like what you hear, hit the subscribe button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate and review the show to help fellow O&P professionals find us.
We'd also like to hear from you directly. What topics do you want us to cover? Do you have any burning questions? Email us with your thoughts and feedback at spspodcast@spsco.com. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.